Okay, so I'm going to share with you now my examination of the who of Philemon. We've done Paul. Well, you've done Paul and Onesimus and Philemon and Archippus and Apphia. I've shared with you my examination of Paul, and now I'm going to share with you my examination of Philemon. So the first question in examining a who is what is said about the person or group in the text. So what's said about Philemon in the text? Well, in verse 1, he is a dear friend and co-worker of Paul and Timothy. In verse 2, the text says about Philemon that there is possibly a church in his house. It depends on who the your refers to when it says the church in your house. In verse 5, the text says about Philemon that he has love for all the saints. In verse 5, the text says about Philemon that he has faith toward the Lord Jesus. In verse 7, the text says about Philemon that the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through him. What a beautiful thing to have said about you. In verse 7, the text says about Philemon that he is Paul's brother. In verse 9, the text says about Philemon that Paul, Paul would rather appeal to him on the basis of love. In verse 11, the text says about Philemon that Onesimus was formerly useless to him. And then again in verse 11 that Onesimus is now useful to him. In verse 12, the text says about Philemon that Paul is sending Onesimus back to him. In verse 14, the text says about Philemon that Paul wants his good deed to be voluntary. In verse 16, the text says about Philemon that Onesimus is now his beloved brother, both in the flesh and in the Lord. In verse 19, the text says about Philemon that he owes Paul his own self. That would be from Paul's perspective. In verse 20, the text says about Philemon, once again, that he is Paul's brother. Now, the other examined questions for who have to do with pronouns. To whom does the pronoun refer? Is there a particular pronoun that's repeated frequently? Is there a change in the use of pronouns? And all of these three questions point out the importance of being able to discern to whom pronouns refer. And we didn't have any trouble with that related to Paul. Those references were pretty obvious. But we need to do a little work with that related to Philemon, okay? And so we need to find out, which things are singular and which are plural at the very least. And that may not help us still know for certain without any question to whom or which group a pronoun refers, but it certainly will help a lot. So I've looked some stuff up in the Greek for you. There are different ways to do this. You don't have to know Greek to do this, but I knew how to look it up, so I just went ahead and did it for you in this case, and that's something I'll help you learn to do if you'd like to do that. In verse 2, the reference to your house is singular, so it's pretty certain that it's Philemon's house. Interestingly, in verse 3, though, grace to you is plural. So Paul switches from greeting Philemon to then talking about grace to you, and it's either to Philemon and Archippus and Apphia, or it's to them and the church that meets in his house. And we simply don't know. It's simply a plural reference. Grace to y'all, okay, in the South. In verses 4 to 21, all the yous are singular. So they're almost certainly referring to Philemon. So that much we can know. It's interesting, though, in verse 22, Paul says, one thing more, prepare a guest room for me. And that's the singular imperative. So he's saying to Philemon, prepare a guest room, for I am hoping through your prayers, plural, to be restored to you, plural. So he's saying, Philemon, prepare a guest room for me, for I am hoping through y'all's prayers to be restored to y'all. If you're not from the South, I apologize, but that makes it real clear that it's plural, okay? In verse 23, Epaphras sends greetings to you, that is to Philemon. Then in verse 25, though, the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with your, plural, the your is plural, but spirit is singular. That may simply be a function of the Greek language. In English, we would almost certainly say your spirits, Okay, but it may simply be a function of the Greek language. I don't know. That one reference is plural and one is singular, but that is the case with what the Greek says. Okay, so these are these are the results of my examination of the who of Philemon, and in the next video I'll share with you the results of my examination of the who of Onesimus, and then we'll move away from the who's. You may be getting tired of the who's, but they're really important, and of course Onesimus is important to Philemon, the book of Philemon, so we do need to do that examination. So I'll be back.